I am Michael Harvey. Can you hear me okay if I step away from the microphone? All right. You can decide whether you want to use a microphone or a big voice for the whole. In addition to being a professor in the Department of Business Management here, I'm also the director of the Holstein program in ethics. And it is with great pleasure today that the Holstein program welcomes Mary Miller to our campus to speak on ethics in our financial system. Sheila Bair will speak after me, and she'll introduce Ms. Miller, who has a remarkable background and wealth of experience to talk about her topic. I just wanted to say a couple of words about the Holstein program and why it's why it's helping to support today's talk. The Holstein program in ethics was established by Richard E. Holstein in 1968, graduate of Washington College, majored in philosophy, went on to medical studies. He went to dental school and became a pediatric surgeon, pediatric dentist, who has worked with thousands and thousands of young people and children over his career. But he always thought about what he learned and how his education started in a fundamental way at Washington College. So he wanted to come back and support ethics, not just in philosophy, where he had majored, not just in the sciences, where he had gotten his advanced education, but across the whole curriculum. And that's really the commitment of the Holstein program, to support ethics across the curriculum, across the campus, and even in the community. It's very nice to see some community members here today. The Holstein program supports speakers, supports curricular innovation in ethics, and supports student research in ethics. At the senior luncheon, there will be one of the student prizes will be for the best work on ethics in a senior capstone. I would like to introduce Sheila Bair, our partner in bringing today's speaker to campus, our senior partner, and the president, as you all know, of Washington College. President Sheila Bair.
Well, thank you, Michael. That was a very nice introduction. And yes, we're very pleased to welcome a good friend and someone I admire very much, Mary Miller, to be a part of our Holstein Ethics series, as well as the George Washington Leadership series, one of our seminal speaker series here at Washington College. It's in the past provided a wonderful opportunity for our students to spend quality time with some of our most influential leaders. The program list, the very distinguished list that Mary now joins, of folks who have participated in the GWLS program. You know, it's hard to believe that, 2017, that we're still talking about women's first. But today, as distinguished guest, has one of many the first herself, which is she was the first woman to hold the position of Undersecretary for Domestic Finance at U.S. Treasury. Now, I used to work at Treasury myself. I was the Assistant Secretary for Financial Institutions, so I was one notch below her. But that is the third most powerful position in the Treasury Department. And not only did she have the Undersecretary position for several years and just had a stellar career there, but for a time she was also acting in the second role, as an interim, as the Deputy Treasury Secretary, doing both jobs and doing them amazingly well. I first got to know Mary, obviously, when I was chair of the FDIC, and we were working, she was in the first wave of appointments with the Obama administration, and we were still reeling from the effects of the financial crisis, trying to get the financial system stabilized. And so it was a real pleasure. She reached out to me early on. We had a nice lunch and forged a friendship and working partnership very early on. Republican and Democrat working together, isn't that nice? So anyway, hopefully we'll see more of those types of partnerships come back in DC. Not so much yet. But before she came to Treasury, she was a very top executive at Rowe Price in Baltimore. She was there for 26 years, working her way up to run the fixed income division at Rowe, which is an amazingly powerful position there. And again, very, very just kudos all around for the incredible job she did at Rowe. And she was also, one of the many things she was known for was recruiting great talent. And I think that's one of the reasons she's here today, because she loves to cultivate talent. She likes to mentor young people, advise them, inspire them to reach high as they enter their careers. And she will have some very, very helpful, I think, insights on her own career and how that might apply to the students in the audience as they contemplate their future after Washington College. She's also been always very principled and ethical in her approach, and so I think it's really, again, just a wonderful person to be talking today about ethics and equity in financial services, where clearly we still need to do some work because we need more people like Mary Miller in financial services, functioning at the very, very top of financial services firms. Just again, though, to let you know just how important she was when she was at Treasury. Actually, her first job was the Assistant Secretary for Financial Markets, which was under the Undersecretary for Domestic Finance. And in that role, she basically controlled Treasury financing, right? So she basically controlled the bond market, because the Treasury bond market controls everything. And it's actually so powerful that, nobody ever does anything in D.C. without saying first, well, how's the bond market going to react, right? So Congress, every question, every policy change is how the bond market's going to react. And actually, James Carville, who was a political advisor to Bill Clinton, was very famous in once saying that when he was reincarnated, he wanted to come back as the bond market, because the bond market was everything and had the most powerful influence in D.C. So Mary was in charge of that market, and she didn't even have to die and be reincarnated to get into that role. So Mary, it's great to have you here. She was also a good partner with other financial regulators in implementing the Dodd-Frank Act, which is much debated now, obviously. But we had to take the financial system had to take some tough medicine after the crisis, and not all of those reforms were popular. They were necessary, and so we continue to fight today to make sure that the important improvements we've made to stabilize the financial system continues. So now she stepped down from her government post in 2014. She's presently serving as the director of SVB Financial Group, as well as the Intercontinental Exchange Benchmark Administration based in London, and doing a lot of philanthropy, which she is also very well known for, and privileging us with her presence today. Thanks very much, Mary.
Thank you so much for that great introduction. Is this too loud or okay? It's okay? Good. So I have about 25 minutes of remarks, and then I would like to take questions. I think that would be more engaging. I heard a very disturbing fact the other day that in the average classroom, you only have people's attention for about 8 minutes. So I'm asking you to stay with me. I promise to be expeditious in delivering these remarks, and I look forward to your questions. So thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I count myself as extraordinarily lucky to have had two great jobs in the private and public sectors. Of course, my work at the U.S. Treasury only came about because of the devastating financial crisis that unfolded between 2007 and 2009. The crisis itself laid bare the connection between our financial system and the real economy. The financial system is supposed to fuel economic growth, converting savings into loans and investments, helping individuals and businesses thrive. It should not be a source of risk itself. But an over-leveraged, under-regulated, and opaque financial sector had evolved over decades and inflicted incredible damage on our economy and society, measured in lost jobs, savings, homes, businesses, and of course, rising debt. The diminished capacity of our economy played out for years. The financial crisis is the reason that I left a very comfortable job at Rowe Price to work at the Treasury. I knew that we couldn't weather a storm like that again. We needed to fix a very broken financial system that had failed our country and its citizens. It provided the opportunity to re-examine everything about this essential industry and the role that it should play in our economy. When I try to put myself in your shoes and think about the way you must regard the financial sector, it's pretty discouraging. Many of you were in your early teens when the financial crisis occurred, and while not old enough to be a full participant in the economy, you undoubtedly felt some of the impact. Last fall, a Facebook study of those aged 18 to 34 found that 92% of those surveyed do not trust financial institutions to handle their money. I'm not surprised. More concerning is the reality that many of you would not consider working in this industry given all that you have witnessed and experienced. While many steps have been taken to strengthen the banking system, increase transparency, and protect consumers, I'm not going to focus today on the financial reforms that have been adopted, although we can certainly talk about them when we get to questions. Just trust me when I say that the financial system is in much better shape today than in 2008. And Sheila Bair is certainly one of the architects of that. Instead, I would like to talk about issues of equity and ethics in financial firms that are every bit as important in changing the toxic culture that created such havoc. Much of the data that I will reference was developed for a research project at Columbia University that is focused on the progress of women in the financial sector. But these points would apply to all underrepresented participants. No matter where I look, the numbers are pretty stark. After a deep dive into the literature, my head was spinning from consultant reports, media stories, and industry data on the progress or lack thereof of women holding leadership positions in the financial sector. What is equally obvious is the very slow progress this industry is making to become a more diverse and inclusive force for the real economy. It's particularly surprising given the growing evidence that firms with more female leaders deliver better returns to their shareholders. The data show that globally about 20% of financial firm board members are women, about 16% of the top jobs are held by women, including about 8% of the CEOs in the financial sector. In my former industry, according to Morningstar research, the percentage of female portfolio managers of mutual funds is stuck at about 10%. While all of these percentages are slowly rising, it will take decades to reach any sense of parity at this pace. If women represent 51% of the population and 47% of the labor force, if they have attained even higher education levels than men, make 80% of the consumption decisions in our economy, and demographically are likely to live longer and make very consequential financial decisions, then why aren't they more represented at the highest levels of financial firms? How much GDP, income, savings, and wealth are we leaving on the table by not being more gender inclusive? This isn't just a matter of rearranging the seats at the table. A recent report by the McKinsey Global Institute estimated that the world could add $12 to $28 trillion to global GDP by 2025 if women participated at their full potential. The economic consequences are one thing. Equally important, how much raw talent, consumer insight, innovation, and judgment are financial firms missing by not having women in key roles? This is a huge economic opportunity to consider. Given this state of affairs, my own experience seems rather implausible, but perhaps useful in allowing me to make some observations about issues in recruitment, retention, and promotion that all deserve attention. In 1983, I was hired as a financial analyst by a then relatively small asset management firm. I got the job by answering an ad in the Wall Street Journal. Imagine getting a job that way today. Seriously, given the use of electronic search tools to screen resumes and word searches to eliminate or select candidates, needless to say, I wouldn't have passed that screen today. I had no financial sector experience, an unrelated graduate degree, and had been working for a nonprofit public policy research institute. All in all, pretty unpromising. But someone read my cover letters, looked at my research, and invited me for an interview. In short, someone took a chance on me. Over the next 26 years, I worked as an analyst, earned a chartered financial analyst certification, became a trader, a portfolio manager, the fixed income division director, and finally a member of a 6-person management committee running the company. During those decades, the company went public, the assets under management grew exponentially, and the number of employees grew from about 200 to 6,000. What is obvious is that I benefited from the right company at the right time, meaning an industry poised for rapid growth with the explosion of mutual funds, the introduction of the 401k retirement industry, and global expansion. I once joked in a local newspaper interview that if you could deliver consistent and strong investment performance, you could be a green frog and advance in investment management. For that comment, my office was a showcase of frogs that people sent me after they read that. I sometimes wonder if young people hired today have the patience to stay in one place for that long and reap the benefits of promotions that grew from experience, performance, and familiarity with my colleagues. High levels of turnover simply do not allow enough time for advancement. When I counsel young people to stay at a good job with good prospects for more than a few years, they usually look at me with polite skepticism. But the data on mid-career exit rates are also very worrisome. Women may be equally hired in this sector, but they are under-promoted and, not surprisingly, are over-exiting. In the financial sector, women are 20 to 30% more likely to leave their employer mid-career than women in other sectors. In that vein, my advice list for young people either in or contemplating a job in the financial sector would take the following form. First, look for dynamic opportunities in parts of the industry that offer growth opportunities. I know those may be hard to see, and my own experience may have just been dumb luck. But if you stand back from the financial sector today and look at the developments in financial technology, trading execution, the delivery of financial advice, and investment management, there's a lot to consider. And when you find an opportunity with interesting work and people that you respect, then roll up your sleeves and stick with it. Second, pay attention to whom you work for. The people I worked under were always men, but some really looked out for me. In a very unscientific sample, I could say that the most helpful were men with wives that worked or daughters in the workforce, but there were some notable exceptions. Much is written today about unconscious bias in the workplace that can block recruiting and retention efforts and unknowingly shape an organization's culture. I certainly didn't know anything about that field of inquiry back then, but I did recognize that there were some people who looked at me differently than others did. They gave me new assignments, put me in the spotlight on many occasions, and over the years became some of my closest friends. That was my experience. Nevertheless, nearly every woman I know who has left the financial sector has some searing stories about being left out, ignored, or passed over. I would never advocate staying in a job where you are truly unhappy or mistreated, which is why it is so important to do your homework on the kinds of people you want to work with, whether male or female. A boss who will look out for you and help you advance can change the whole trajectory. My third piece of advice about working in this sector is to do something that is quantifiable and less subject to qualitative judgment. Managing fixed income portfolios, for example, is highly quantitative. I used to say that I got a daily report card and it was pretty easy to measure my skill versus others. One of the troubling things that I see in the industry data is how often senior jobs in the financial industry held by women are in non-manufacturing roles. By that I mean that too often women are not running the portfolios, managing sales and trading activities, or in the highest risk-taking jobs. Is that by choice? I don't think so. To use a sports analogy, I think that women simply are not getting the at-bat opportunities. I don't believe the issue is any lack of competitive spirit, and I think the best offense is to be allowed to prove your skill with facts. Fourth, of course, I have a few thoughts about the issues presented by having children while working, since I had my 2 sons while working full-time. I appreciate that there is real anxiety both about whether your time away from work will hurt your advancement potential or whether your children are in good hands. These issues, of course, are not unique to the financial sector. On the first point, I would say that my 18 weeks of maternity leave in total represented 1.3% of my 26 years at this firm, which is pretty negligible in terms of my long-term contribution. Of course, it didn't hurt that I had worked there more than a few years and built many relationships before I had children. When I signaled my desire to come back to work and take on more, that only helped my prospects. Finally, there's another loss to companies that don't support working mothers. Nothing was more fulfilling, humbling, and broadening for me than raising children. I brought that experience to the job every day, and I'm certain that it made me a better manager of people as I gained those responsibilities. I recall jumping in once when a young and very talented analyst was about to quit, overwhelmed by family responsibilities. I offered a 4-day work week, and that extra day was all it took to help her manage the family's needs. She's still working there nearly 20 years later, and I think we all benefited. So to connect these remarks to some suggestions, I want to say that while the numbers and pace of change are certainly disappointing, I'm cautiously optimistic. The first reason is the extraordinary amount of attention this issue is getting. In our age of big data, I don't think companies can hide on this issue. One of my colleagues used to say, "What gets measured gets performed." Setting measurable goals is one way to speed performance on diversity and inclusion. By that, I don't mean setting quotas from the outside. I'm not convinced that will work as well as full transparency and goal setting inside companies. So let me make a few suggestions based on my recent tour of the literature on this topic and my own experience. Clearly, these ideas are my own. If we want to affect real change at a faster pace, then I would put more focus inside companies than on their boards. That may sound like heresy, but I don't see enough evidence that adding more women to boards, which is likely to continue anyway, is really improving the fate of women inside the companies they oversee. The performance data from MSCI says that companies with women on their boards financially outperform those without women board members. That knowledge alone will continue to fuel board search committees to find more women. But other data show little correlation between more female board members and more women in leadership positions inside those same companies. So I'm more interested in what's going on inside firms. Is more diversity a, quote, nice to have on the top 10 corporate objectives? Or is it a real goal that CEOs are driving throughout the company? Is appreciation for this issue a criterion for promoting and hiring CEOs and their direct reports? Who's fighting for this inside the company? Too often I saw a member of a minority group put in the position of advancing diversity, usually a lateral hire with little power to affect change and no direct involvement in the key profit drivers of the company. We need to look at the incentives for advancing women and other underrepresented groups. It doesn't seem to be enough to say that the company's financial performance and growth will benefit from a more diverse workforce. That benefit is too indirect for the individuals who can affect change. I think there should be clear financial incentives for these individuals to achieve measurable progress in a defined time frame. This is among the strongest signals that leadership can send. Of course, at the very outset, I think there's an opportunity to review hiring and recruiting practices to widen the aperture for candidate flow. I mentioned earlier my concerns about robo-resume reading that screens out many non-traditional candidates. Who among us can't think of a person we've worked with or known with significant skill and talent that would nonetheless be screened out? How can we use human resources departments to cast a wider net for the financial sector? Once you get past recruiting, I think you need to really zero in on the early stages of careers. The exit rate of women in their early and middle years is clearly bad for the company, since turnover is disruptive and costly, but it's also likely harming their own potential for growth and wealth building. A ripe area for research, in my view, would be to compare the career progress of women who stay and those who go. Where are they 5 years out, 10 years out? If we could show that by staying, you are better off from a career, income, and wealth building position, we could meaningfully change the dialogue. Of course, if we can't, then we need to redouble our efforts. Let me share one story. I think that feelings are often raw on this subject, with men feeling aggrieved and women feeling wronged. My husband says he feels aggrieved all the time by me. It's hard to have honest conversations about how to change. In my old firm, we had a very team-based orientation and a strong athletic culture. There were softball leagues, tennis leagues, basketball leagues, etc. I played in both the tennis and softball games, and I enjoyed it. But one day, a young woman approached me and said that she wasn't athletic and that she felt left out. That opened my eyes to something I simply hadn't appreciated about the company. So I asked her what she'd like to do in her spare time, and she said she liked to read. Together, we started a book club that met once a month over lunch. I remember reading The Kite Runner about Afghanistan, Moneyball, Michael Lewis's book about baseball, and Nelson Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom. I was amazed by who turned out for the book club, both men and women, including some of our most hard-boiled alpha male traders. I filed this experience in my mental management file called Never Judge a Book by Its Cover. The point is that you can choose to create an inclusive company that fosters positive relationships and all the benefits that come with that. In my experience, a firm that treats its employees fairly is more likely to treat its customers fairly. If more diversity leads to better financial results, less employee turnover, and better client outcomes, this seems like a goal well worth pursuing. I've been talking about the need to build more diverse teams in the financial sector, but I'm also interested in the discussion about culture and ethics inside financial firms that has followed the financial crisis. I have always liked a comment attributed to Christine Lagarde, who heads the International Monetary Fund. What if the name of that firm had been Lehman Sisters? There is some evidence that firms with more female board members have fewer governance problems, along with better financial performance. The New York Federal Reserve Bank has been leading an initiative to raise awareness about culture in the financial services industry and how things need to change. While their focus is largely on legal and ethical transgressions that affect financial markets, their work opens the way for a broader investigation into the environment for women and other underrepresented groups. I see the same dialogue occurring in the United Kingdom and the subject regularly appearing on more conference agendas. I'm also encouraged to see the topic of ethics being added to business school class agendas as a specific area of focus. Ethics inside financial firms is a very hard thing to measure, other than by the consequences of poor judgment and bad behavior. We have been bombarded with examples of customers of financial institutions being mistreated in home mortgage foreclosure practices, cross-selling of unnecessary financial products, discriminatory lending, hidden fees and charges. The list is long. No wonder the public doesn't trust the financial system. But if we just focus on the outcomes, we aren't asking the right questions about where all of this begins. What messages are being delivered from the top of the firm, and how are they monitored down the line? How are compensation plans designed to create incentives for performance? What is rewarded and what is discouraged? Is the focus on short-term or long-term results? Is the company focused on both shareholder returns and the customer experience? And who is held accountable when things go wrong? I don't have the answers to all these questions, but I think that starting there is much better than picking up the pieces of financial and reputational damage that results from a weak culture that encourages bad behavior. Up to now, I've been focused on the private sector. I'd like to spend my last few moments talking about work in the public sector. Our financial system could not exist without the regulations, policies, and infrastructure that underpins these institutions. If you want to read the best history of the foundations of our financial system, then I recommend reading about Alexander Hamilton, our first Treasury Secretary and now the subject of a very popular musical. I believe there is enormous value in encouraging talented men and women from all walks of life to pursue public service to make sure our financial and regulatory systems keep pace with financial innovation and that our markets are fair, competitive, and safe. I would also note that women are better represented in senior roles at central banks and regulators than in the private sector. My own experience is instructive. I came to the Treasury Department after a long career in investment management at a particularly challenging moment. I hoped that the knowledge and experience I brought from the private sector would be useful, but I had no idea what to expect. In fact, I learned more from the senior career civil servants than I could ever have taught them. Before I went to Washington, I did not fully appreciate the intricacies of the rule-writing process that underpins financial regulation. The process involves painstaking rounds of proposals, comment periods, and meetings with every constituency. In the private sector, I knew there were usually 2 or 3 sides to every story, but 5 or 6, welcome to Washington. In the private sector, I never worried about the unintended consequences of a decision 10 or 20 years from now. At the Treasury, every decision you make has different economic consequences for various stakeholders and is likely to play out across the economy for years to come. You are constantly challenged to think harder and smarter about issues than you ever have. If you are interested in public policy affecting our financial system, there is no better place to develop these skills than the financial agencies and the government. You will constantly be taking on some of the most interesting and complex problems of our day. Take student loans, for example. The business model of higher education finance has changed a great deal over the past decade, with important implications for student borrowers, families, and lending institutions, not to mention the federal budget. The government has a responsibility to align our goals for higher education with the financial realities of students and families who may be incurring large amounts of debt. There are many issues to consider, whether lending is on or off the federal balance sheet, how interest rates should be set, loan deferral and forgiveness policies, and income-based repayment, to name a few. I know this is a topic closely followed by your college president. So if you're interested in the financial sector, I encourage you to consider opportunities in both the public and private sectors, and maybe have the chance to work in both. One experience informs the other and deepens our collective understanding of how our financial system should work. There are many who do not believe that individuals can move from the private sector to the public sector or vice versa without impossible conflicts of interest, using terms like captured regulators and foxes guarding the hen house. I disagree. It's certainly important to recruit the right candidates, those who understand the difference between working for shareholders and working for taxpayers, and those who have a true interest in public service. And we need appropriate safeguards against revolving door issues. But to effectively oversee our complex financial system, we need regulators with deep experience in financial products and markets, and we need industry professionals who understand risk and regulatory objectives. At the end of the day, we will all benefit from a safe and fair financial system. Thank you very much for the chance to share these thoughts. I hope I've given you some reasons to think about bringing your talents to work in this dynamic and interesting sector. I look forward to any questions that you have, and I also look forward to seeing some of you leading the financial sector. Thank you very much. Terrific. All right, don't make me stand up here in silence. Yes? Yeah. So the question is, to what degree do I think that big data, artificial intelligence, and there's a third thing, well, are going to affect the financial sector? In a very broad sense, I would say that data is transforming everything. In a good way, when I talk about things like how can we use data to get more objective evidence of the progress that firms are making in hiring, promoting, retention, et cetera. I think there are, I'm not actually competent to talk about artificial intelligence. I read about it in the paper, but I don't know enough about that one. I see data being used by financial institutions in remarkable ways. I sit on the board of one company in London that is overseeing a financial market benchmark called LIBOR. And LIBOR was broadly challenged by it was part of the financial crisis period, but the challenge really turned on the fact that traders were manipulating LIBOR, a interest rate benchmark that is used to reference, sit down, $350 trillion of financial contracts. And this benchmark was a very poorly governed survey of bankers asking them what they thought their cost of borrowing amongst each other was. And not surprisingly, the process of creating that figure led to all sorts of mischief, including people pushing that interest rate in directions that would benefit themselves and their own trading books. So what we've been working on for the last 3 years is to move the calculation of LIBOR to a market-based calculation as opposed from a survey of opinions. And the only thing that can enable that is massive data from banking institutions. So the governance has changed, the practice has changed, the calculation has changed, and that couldn't have happened without the use of enormous data. So I can think of examples that are extremely useful in the positive sense. I think where you begin to cross some lines is when data crosses lines of privacy in terms of using data in ways that are good for a financial institution, perhaps not so good for an individual whose privacy is violated in terms of their credit history and so forth. So I think that coming back to a point I made about the fact that financial innovation often outruns the ability to regulate and oversee it, we've got to stay pretty close to this one, because I think the risks could be enormous if data is misused, if cybersecurity causes the loss of data or the inappropriate access to data. But at the same time, I can see ways in which it's beneficial in terms of informing decisions and helping financial institutions understand their customers better to make better financial products. It's also useful if it can lower transaction costs. There's an enormous amount going on in the payments industry, for example, in terms of trying to make it easier to transact without costs, and data is enabling that exercise. So I think, to try to answer your question, I think data is transforming the industry incredibly fast. I think there are many positive aspects. There are also risks, and I think it is the job of overseers to try to manage those risks and stay with them. Yeah. So, yes. Yeah.
So I teach organizational behavior, so it's a great talk on finance. I'm going to ask you about the people side of the business. It's about HR and operations.
Yeah.
You seem to hint at this a little bit, perhaps with what you were saying about some minority candidates might be given positions but kept away from real operations
Yeah.
power. Does the financial sector have a problem where HR is too far from the engine that actually runs the company? And more broadly speaking, is that a problem for HR in general, that the experts and bureaucrats in charge of hiring, diversity programs, and coaching and training don't really connect with the guts of the work, or are those two functions sort of integrated?
Yeah, no, I think I was trying to make that point. I was in the financial industry for almost 30 years, and so, in the 1980s, the issues were different than the 2000s. I would say in the 80s and 90s, we were fumbling on this diversity issue and how could we make it work. And typically what would happen is someone would be hired in HR and told, make this company more diverse. But that person wasn't really controlling the hiring, promotion, recruitment, day-to-day mentoring of people in the line jobs. And so my point was, I never saw it really work very well that way. I think human resources needs to be wired in to the management and to the risk-taking roles in the company. So I'm very pleased now when I see that the head of HR is on that management committee that I was on some time ago. Because really, a financial company, what are your assets? We used to joke the assets go up and down the elevator every day. It's the people. And if you don't get the people right, you don't get the culture right, you don't get the business right, you don't get a lot of things right. So HR is actually hugely important to the organization, and I think needs to be, right at the table with the profit centers of the company. If you're connecting them better, I think you're just inevitably going to get better outcomes. And I think, all of the data is saying companies that are more diverse have better financial results. That is a compelling commercial, imperative. If that's the case, then you should want that. But you can't get that unless you really have a well-functioning human resources element in the company. I'm going to tell one other story, which was kind of funny, about when I was hired. I told you I was hired responding to a newspaper ad in the Wall Street Journal, and not long after I was hired, I took some sort of personality test. That we didn't have a human resources department, then we had a personnel department, and they asked me to take some kind of vector test, and it was like, I remember a sort of word association, like here's a word, pick a word, and I did it. A few weeks later, the head of personnel called me to his office, and he was sitting at his desk. There was nothing on it but a single piece of paper, which didn't look like a very promising kind of encounter. He had his hands folded, he was sitting there, and he said, sit down. And I thought, have I done something? Am I about to be fired? What's happening? And he said, I have the results of your personality test here. And he said, I thought we had hired Mary Milquetoast, and we seem to have Mary Pitbull. And apparently all the words I'd chosen were very aggressive words or something. And, you know, I look sort of unpromising and small and all that. So he was quite, you know, taken aback, and I said, well, what are you going to do? And he said, I'm just going to tear this up and we'll forget about it. So, anyway, but it was sort of an interesting story about human resources. That was sort of the dark ages of not really knowing what to do with your personality tests or anything. They probably should have done the test before they hired me, but they hadn't, so thankfully. Anyway, yeah. Okay. First of all, I'll tell you that my sister is a professor of philosophy, and she is my father's proudest moment. He would always say to me, I will stick by you regardless of what happens. But my sister is his pride and joy. So we do have some philosophical roots in my family. Well, the company that I worked for had a profit-sharing plan, and by law, these have to be extended to everyone who works in the company. And I think it's an enormously positive incentive for people to stay at a company that has long-term implications for savings and wealth building. I don't know the answer to what percentage of small businesses do that. We have kind of a bifurcated small business economy that I pay attention to. We have the fast-growing startups that you read about, the Silicon Valley companies, and the many outside of Silicon Valley who are fast-growing small companies that are stock-driven, and often their form of compensation is to share that among the founders and employees. And then we have what I call the more Main Street small businesses that are running companies and businesses on Main Street that are not, you know, they're solid companies, but they're not growing at that fast pace. And I think they are often private companies. They're not issuing stock. They're not registering stock in a way that they could share that with their employees. So I would guess that it's rather bifurcated in the small business environment, that certain kind of companies are driven by growth imperatives where they want to share that opportunity with their employees. Personally, I think it's a very good tool to have in terms of having the collective benefit of people participating in the success of the company. And if you didn't take this from my remarks, I think there is benefit from staying with a company long enough to build your skill and to get the benefits, whether they're simply, you know, retirement benefits that you have accumulated so that you have that financial security. But I think it's a very good tool, I think, for incenting long-term performance. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So first off, I want to say thank you for speaking on Equitable and an ethical financial system. Here at Washington College, we actually do senior classroom experiences, and this is exactly what my senior thesis is on.
Oh, here you go.
So one thing that I've found is that in a lot of my research, typically the women who are internally driving all of these diversity initiatives typically have personality traits similar to Mary Pitbull, right? So the leadership is more on a, and the personality traits are more on a spectrum. How do you think that in promoting women internally, that HR, to Dr. Hardy's point, can identify the women who typically have not male-dominant traits and instead diversify leadership and diversify managers based on the underrepresented, typically female associated traits. That's one thing that I've struggled with in my thesis is many women who are super successful have these more aggressive personality traits, but we're lacking the women who are more compassionate.
Yeah.
In
That's a great question. I'm not sure, what part of the problem I think is it's very hard in a interview process to tease out the sort of things you'd want to know about someone that would make them successful over the long term. So often both sides are sort of, fumbling to try to figure that out. I would always say to people, do your homework on this company, do your homework on the people, ask lots of questions, interview your interviewer, try to really get a sense for how people behave and think and so forth. I think that I heard an interesting statistic, maybe this is an aside and not directly at your question, but one of my friends who is a venture capitalist on the West Coast in a very competitive environment said she had been told by one of the accounting firms that some percentage over 90 of women who are CEOs played sports. And that seems to feed into something. I thought that one was interesting. I think we need a mix of traits. You don't want everybody to be the same or to think the same or behave the same. That, I think, has been proven by all of the research that a more diverse set of characteristics is going to lead to better thinking, more creative decisions. I think what we need are people who are really open to a range of personalities and styles. It's very easy to hire someone that's just like you. You're very comfortable with that decision. It is hard to hire someone who's totally different. I'll just tell you about the person who hired me at Rowe Price in 1983. He was a Air Force veteran, super military, super athletic, a sailor. He was very profane, he was extremely tough, and he was married to a former beauty contest winner. And you would think, well, that isn't the sort of person that would like me. I'm obviously different gender, small, not military, not beauty contest person or anything. And I've always admired the fact that he hired the most diverse collection of people around him. He was really looking for skill. He was really looking for knowledge and talent in something that he was doing. And it didn't matter to him. And this was, that was 1983. That is an unusual trait in a CEO. He went on to become the CEO of the company, and I think was responsible for really instilling a great culture at Rowe Price. And he'd be one of the people who gave me opportunities, who saw something in me that, ended up working to my advantage. But I think maybe the issue is trying to get at who are the interviewers, who are the people making the choices, how do they think, how open are they to a wide range of outcomes? I don't know if that answers your question. It's a hard question. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Great. Yeah.
I have a question. My goal in the next 5 to 10 years is to build music studios. It's an entertainment company.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know people with money and what kind of advice you can give me to start working on to go to a private sector for financial investment in my company.
Sure. Well, what you might do is you might look around in the area and see if there are any early stage equity groups. They're usually called an angels group that supplies capital to startups and is interested in very early ideas. And I just go listen to some of the companies that are pitching. I joined a group in Baltimore called Baltimore Angels because I wanted to learn more about the startup world. And I have listened to some pitches for some truly remarkable companies. Some of them are so different I can't begin to get my brain wrapped around them. But it's a good milieu to put yourself in just to see what are the ingredients of a company pitch, if you will, to try to attract investors and get people to support you. Usually the earliest stages are called friends and family. You call your brother, you call your best friend, and try to get them to help you. But then there's like next round financing. But I would say just try to acquaint yourself with some of those groups and how they work. Go watch it a little bit. There's also something interesting that is part of a law passed in 2012 called crowdfunding, which is an internet-based way to raise capital for ideas. And I am constantly amazed at the money people raise using crowdfunding. So that might be something to look at. There are a number of sites that you can get online to look at. Sure. Yeah.
Yes, you mentioned briefly student loan market, and of course, in higher ed, we're following the
Yeah,
news
yeah.
very closely. I wonder what your thoughts are about where regulation of that industry is going to go.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking, for
Yeah.
example, about the gainful employment rule. Looks like that's going to be delayed.
Yeah.
Think about the for-profit education sector in particular. That is certainly the single biggest factor, but the factor in the
Yeah.
crisis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a tough question to answer because we haven't really heard much from the new administration about what they think about higher education. I was driving down here today, and there's actually a story about this on the radio about a new report that the New York Fed had put out about student loans. When I was in the government, I think there was a lot of concern about the for-profit schools, the gainful employment issue that you referenced, the scorecard, which was deeply unpopular with many institutions, and trying to figure out how to better approach, the levels of debt we were seeing and the incomes people were earning after leaving college. So a lot of the thrust was towards income-based repayment and thinking about how to do that. I would be the first to say that when I looked into it, the programs were incredibly complex. There were too many of them, and they're really hard to understand. And so what I would hope to see is that any federal government response would be to simplify and make it clearer going into college what the choices are and what the outcomes are. I think too many people go into debt at age 18 without really understanding the back end of that. We're paying the price for that now. I imagine some of the initiatives may be scaled back. We're seeing a number of regulations getting scaled back. But I guess I don't really want to speculate. I don't know. I don't know what Betsy DeVos thinks about higher education or whether, they'll continue some of the thrusts. I think one of the things that troubled me the most in the government, because I am a fiscal hawk, since I had to manage the federal debt, I was worried about that all the time. But I think we've wandered into student loan debt without a real understanding of the long-term costs. I don't think the federal government knew when it introduced something like income-based repayment what the costs of that might be down the road. And I think that there's very fuzzy math on a lot of this, and I think that it would be a great contribution if we tried to put some hard dollars into the equation to talk about what are we willing to do as a country, what should fall on the students and what should fall on the taxpayers, and go into it eyes wide open, because I think it is a very murky financial forecast. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Any others? Good. Welcome.